As mentioned before, you're an environmental planner and a land use planner. You're employed here in town by Greddy Associates. And Greddy provides services for developers who need to address environmental regulations while they are building. So having that as your background, do you think you can be objective as a commissioner when you're asked to make big decisions about how those projects should be managed, about the ordinances that guide those developments?
Yes, absolutely. Working in various different environmental and land use regulations on a daily basis, I think I have a really broad, deep understanding of how those regulations are designed, how the language is tailored, and how it's intended to be implemented. And I think that that can be very beneficial in the decision-making process. And it can also help guide decision-making in the future with regard to specific policy making and how it impacts various different departments who are implementing those regulations, so that we are moving in the direction of making it easier for Chelan County residents to apply for projects under those regulations and find a positive resolution with those applications and see decision-making being approved for residents. And recently, that hasn't necessarily been the experience of residents as they're interacting with the planning and building department, but I would really like to be able to affect some positive change in that area.
Do you feel like you would be able to maintain both jobs if you were elected commissioner? Would you have to leave one for the other?
You know, that remains to be seen. Right now, I intend to probably work a little bit part-time at Greddy Associates if I am granted the opportunity to serve as a county commissioner. However, I would transition my work out of Chelan County and into other various counties where my firm works. Greddy Associates has an office in Tacoma and here in Wenatchee, and we work all across the state, so transitioning my work to another location wouldn't be a challenge.
So working with projects outside the county would avoid conflict of interest?
Correct.
If it came to that?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about community development. The department has been kind of a focus of yours as you've campaigned. What have been the difficulties there? We've had some turnover in executive staff, we've had some turnover in planning staff, so from your perspective, what's been the difficulty?
I think the difficulty has been having a director with local historical and institutional knowledge of Chelan County and its adopted regulations. Historically, directors have been hired from out of area or out of state that don't know and understand the local regulations and the public process that those regulations went through for the adoption. And so there's some understanding that gets lost in that sphere because they don't know how the public interacted with county staff and with the commissioners through the public process, the comments that were provided that helped tailor the language specific to Chelan County residents. And you know, there's a lack of understanding with how the language is meant to be implemented as well. And so that has created some conflict through the application and processing process. And oftentimes there's conflict through the decision-making process within that department.
There's an interim director in place right now for community development, and commissioners will be working to hire somebody soon. So if you were on the commission at that time, you would favor a candidate who was local versus one who applied from a different county?
That would be my hope. Earlier this year, the commissioners flew the job and they didn't receive any applications. I believe it was open for 4 or 5 months and they didn't receive any. So, you know, it's my hope that I have the opportunity to be a part of that hiring process, and my goal would be to try and find somebody local with that historical institutional knowledge that can really guide that department back into a more public service oriented department that is working to establish a positive public experience, public service, and that is really interested in working with residents to find solutions so that they can get their permits approved rather than looking for ways to potentially deny a permit.
Can you think of other county departments that the commissioners supervise where they need a firmer hand from the commissioners, where they need a little bit of input from the elected officials?
You know, I think that it's kind of a give and take with the commissioners coordinating with various different department heads, those that are hired versus those that are elected. And, you know, for the most part, I think that most of those relationships are pretty strong right now.
The Wenatchee Valley Chamber held its summit about a month ago, and you were asked during that summit, how Chelan County can help some small businesses. Your response was, Chelan County can get out of the way. We have some tough regulations that make it really difficult for businesses to establish or to expand. Can you think of examples? What regulations you would want to take a second look at that might be impeding economic growth?
My comment was a little tongue-in-cheek, but it was also based on my near-daily basis or near-daily experience with Chelan County community development these days, as I'm representing my clients and the projects that they are trying to get approved. And over time, it seems like the local regulations have become more restrictive, and interpretations of language have become more restrictive, making it a lot more challenging to get permits approved. And as the language continues to change or just be interpreted in different ways, it's creating an environment where you need multiple permits before you can even get a project off the ground. And when that permitting process is also taking multiple months to 6 months to 9 months to get a permit approved, you have a lot of financial challenges associated with that. And sometimes when the permitting process is taking so long, it deems a project infeasible financially. And so we're seeing a lot of negativity associated with that, in that it's hindering economic development, it's hindering people's opportunities to establish their property rights, develop their properties in certain ways, or expand existing development on their property, as well as businesses being able to establish small businesses or expand their existing small business and be more financially solvent into the future.
Mission Ridge is an example I think you brought up at the same summit of a business that's having difficulty with some expansion, and they want to expand their footprint quite greatly. Mm-hmm. And you said they're really having trouble moving forward because community development is getting in their way. The ownership of Mission Ridge is currently suing Chelan County over this very topic. Does this indicate, Ann, that you'd be willing to side with developers against county departments that are trying to guide land use practices? I suppose it could raise the concern of micromanagement from the commissioner level of the departments that are trying to interpret the codes.
I don't think it's an us or them answer. I don't think that commissioners should be up against department heads and working in conflict with them. I think that it's important to have really great, strong relationships with department heads, particularly community development, that has so much impact on various different types of development and successes within Chelan County. With Mission Ridge specifically, they're an incredible legacy company within the Wenatchee Valley and have been longstanding for quite some time. And I believe that it's important for the county commissioners to, one, hire a community development director that they can really trust is going to be able to do the job correctly, and then let that director do that job and work within the confines of their regulations, and stick with the language rather than creating interpretations that are not in line with the language, and really moving projects forward, trying to find solutions to issues, and implementing the regulations correctly rather than creating unnecessary roadblocks.
Well, Chelan County is dealing with an issue at Number 1 Canyon right now where a developer has been moving some earth. The county says, hey, you were doing this without proper permitting. The neighboring land trust says this is impinged on our property and our easements. A real mess up there, and also the threat of potential erosion if it's not done properly. So does the county need to toughen up on ordinances for things like site preparation and grading? Is there a need for more regulation of when a site is being prepared for construction, or is this sort of a one-off where we don't need to address it again through more county code enforcement?
I believe it's more the latter. I believe this is a bit of a one-off. I believe that there are a lot of local and state regulations that are already in place that can help prevent this type of development on a property. And I think that more proper code enforcement would help prevent these types of activities from happening in the future. There are a lot of environmental regulations in place that can help prevent this sort of thing. And if the county had really pushed on their code enforcement a little bit earlier, I think we could have prevented some of the damage that we are seeing.
And is there anything else you could think about that I didn't ask about that you think voters should know about you and your candidacy?
You know, I've been getting a lot of questions about short-term rentals recently because that's a hot button issue for various different areas within Chelan County. And I think it would be important for the county residents to know that I support regulating short-term rentals, but I do believe that the current regulations that were adopted about a year ago are a little bit cumbersome and complex. And I think that one of the biggest challenges with the existing short-term rental regulations is that community development is having some challenges internally with properly implementing those regulations, and that in turn is seeing some challenges in the permitting process and creating a lot of frustrations with particularly existing short-term rental owners in properly permitting their short-term rentals and being able to continue in operation. And I think that through the process of hiring a director that knows and understands regulations and how to properly implement the language, we will see some solutions in there and see a more easier permitting process for those that do meet the regulations. And you know, it's been said by some who I've been speaking with that they would just really like the regulations to kind of sit for a couple of years before any changes are made. But we're seeing some challenges in the language currently, and I think that if issues are popping up, we should address them when they're small rather than kind of letting them sit and potentially become bigger issues. And so I would see the need for addressing those small issues and maybe making some small language changes, while at the same time really honoring and respecting all of the work that the task force with the various different interest groups went through over the course of 2 long years to establish the language that was adopted. And so kind of finding a balance between those two, I think, is important.
And the Sheriff's Office recently took over the task of enforcement for short-term rental ordinances, so some changes there moving forward.
Yes, code enforcement was moved in completion over to the Sheriff's Office out of community development. And I think that there are a few challenges there, as you know, any new kind of shift will have. But I think that having a robust enforcement department is going to be really important, you know, across the broad expanse of code regulations, so that people have an expectation of how that's going to play out for them.
Well, STRs is an important issue, so I'm glad you brought it up. I wish I'd asked that question.
Not a problem.
Ann Hessburg, independent, running for Chelan County Commissioner, District 2. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jefferson.
You're watching the NCW Live channel.